Have you ever felt like someone was trying to tell you something, but the message never arrived? Maybe it wasn't because they didn't care. Maybe it was because they didn't know how to say it. And tonight, there is a story hidden inside Elon Musk's life that feels strangely personal. A story about distance, connection, and a message that was never meant for the public. A message meant for one person, maybe even for you. Because behind the headlines, the billion-dollar companies, the rockets, and the impossible ambitions, there was another side of Elon Musk that very few people ever understood. A side that struggled with something far more complicated than business. Love, connection, and the fear of being truly known. Most people think they understand Elon Musk. They see confidence. They see success. They see a man who seems completely focused on changing the future. But what if that image was only part of the truth? What if behind all the achievements was someone quietly fighting a battle that millions of people experience every day? The battle between protecting your heart and opening it. The battle between independence and intimacy. The battle between being admired and being understood. And that is where this story begins. Not with a rocket launch, not with a billion-dollar deal, but with a question. A question that would follow Elon through relationships, heartbreaks, and emotional transformations for years. Can someone who spends their life building the future still find a place where they truly belong? At first, nobody noticed the signs. People saw the ambition. They saw the relentless drive. They saw the long hours. But hidden underneath was something else. A pattern. One that would quietly shape many of his relationships. The need to keep moving. The need to keep solving. The need to keep building. Psychologists often describe high achievers in an interesting way. Many learn early in life that success creates safety. Achievement becomes certainty. Goals become predictable. But emotions? Emotions are unpredictable. People are unpredictable. Love is unpredictable. And for someone whose entire world revolves around solving problems, uncertainty can feel uncomfortable. The truth was far more complicated. Because the more successful Elon became, the harder it became to answer a simple question. Who actually sees me? Not the entrepreneur. Not the public figure. Not the symbol. Me. Think about that for a moment. How many people in your own life know the real version of you? The version nobody else sees? The fears. The doubts. The moments when you're lying awake at night wondering whether you're enough. Most people spend years hiding those parts. And sometimes success becomes the perfect disguise. Yet one question remained unanswered. What happens when someone finally gets close enough to see beyond it? The answer wasn't simple. Because every meaningful relationship eventually reaches a crossroads. A moment when admiration is no longer enough. A moment when curiosity becomes vulnerability. And vulnerability changes everything. What Elon realized at that moment changed everything. Because genuine connection isn't built through perfection. It's built through exposure. The willingness to let someone see the unfinished parts of you, the flaws, the contradictions, the insecurities. And that's where many relationships begin to struggle. Not because love disappears, but because fear arrives. Fear of rejection, fear of disappointment, fear of being seen clearly. The strange thing about emotional walls is that they often protect us from the very thing we want most. Connection. And that pattern appeared again and again. Not just in Elon Musk's story, in everyone's story. Maybe even yours. Have you ever wanted someone to understand you, but found yourself pulling away the moment they got too close? Have you ever wished for connection while secretly protecting yourself from it? If so, you're not alone. Because human beings are full of contradictions. We crave intimacy, yet we fear vulnerability. We want honesty, yet we hide our deepest truths. And this contradiction became one of the most important lessons hidden inside Elon's two-way emotional journey. But what happened next shocked everyone. Because eventually, something unexpected occurred. The question was no longer whether someone could understand him. The question became whether he could allow himself to be understood. There is a huge difference. One depends on others. The other depends on you. And many people never recognize that distinction. They spend years searching for the right person, the perfect relationship, the perfect connection, without realizing that emotional openness is also a decision, a choice, a risk, a leap. Imagine carrying enormous responsibilities every day. Imagine millions of people watching your successes and failures. Imagine knowing that every decision could become tomorrow's headline. How easy would it be to trust someone completely? How easy would it be to remove the armor? The answer is obvious. It wouldn't. And yet meaningful relationships require exactly that. Not complete exposure, not blind trust, but gradual honesty. the kind that develops over time, the kind that cannot be forced, the kind that quietly transforms two strangers into something much deeper. This is where the mystery becomes fascinating, because many people assume relationships fail because of incompatibility. Sometimes that's true, but often something else is happening. People stop revealing themselves. Conversations become surface level. Emotional risks disappear. Connection slowly fades. Not dramatically, quietly, almost invisibly, until one day both people realize something important is missing, and they can't quite explain what happened. The truth was far more complicated. Because connection isn't lost in one moment. It's lost in 1,000 tiny moments. Moments when someone stays silent. Moments when someone avoids difficult conversations. Moments when someone chooses safety over honesty. And those moments add up. That realization would become incredibly important. Because the deeper Elon looked at relationships, the more he began noticing a pattern. Love wasn't simply about finding the right person. It was about becoming the kind of person capable of sustaining genuine connection. That changes everything. Because now the focus shifts inward. Now the question becomes, what am I afraid to reveal? What part of myself am I protecting? What truth have I never shared? And suddenly the conversation becomes personal. Because every viewer listening right now has an answer, even if they don't realize it. Maybe it's a dream. Maybe it's a fear. Maybe it's a memory. Maybe it's a wound you've carried for years. Whatever it is, it shapes your relationships more than you think. And that realization leads us directly into the next chapter. A chapter where emotional pressure begins to build. A chapter where unanswered questions become impossible to ignore. A chapter where one private message changes everything. Because hidden beneath the public image was a realization Elon could no longer avoid. A realization about connection, about trust, about love, and about the person who might finally understand what nobody else could. But before that answer appeared, another challenge emerged. A challenge that would test everything. And when it arrived, nothing unfolded the way anyone expected. Not Elon, not the people around him, not even the person at the center of the story. Because the message was still unfinished. The truth was still hidden. And the most important revelation had yet to arrive. Before we continue, remember where we left off. The unanswered question, the emotional distance, the feeling that something important remained unsaid. Because sometimes the biggest turning points in life don't begin with action. They begin with awareness. The moment you finally recognize a pattern, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. That was the challenge. Because emotional patterns are powerful. They quietly influence every relationship, every conversation, every decision, and most people never realize they're repeating them. What Elon realized at that moment changed everything. Because for years, achievement had always offered an answer. Work harder, build faster, solve bigger problems, move forward. But relationships don't operate that way. You cannot engineer trust. You cannot manufacture closeness. You cannot force emotional connection. And that realization created conflict. A conflict many successful people experience. The conflict between control and surrender. In business, control creates results. In relationships, too much control often creates distance. Think about that carefully. How often have you tried to manage an outcome emotionally? How often have you wanted certainty before taking a risk? How often have you waited for guarantees before opening your heart? The problem is that guarantees don't exist. Not in love, not in trust, not in connection. Yet one question remained unanswered. Can someone truly connect with another person while constantly protecting themselves? The answer slowly became clear. No, because protection and connection often move in opposite directions. And this is where the emotional conflict intensified. The more someone fears being hurt, the more they create barriers. The more barriers they create, the harder intimacy becomes. The harder intimacy becomes, the lonelier they feel. It's a cycle, a painful one, and many people spend years trapped inside it. The truth was far more complicated, because loneliness doesn't always look like isolation. Sometimes it looks like success. Sometimes it looks like achievement. Sometimes it looks like a crowded room where nobody knows what's happening inside your mind. That realization carries enormous weight, because it means connection isn't measured by how many people surround you. It's measured by how many people truly understand you. And understanding requires honesty, real honesty, the kind that feels uncomfortable, the kind that creates vulnerability, the kind that changes relationships forever. But what happened next shocked everyone, because the breakthrough didn't arrive through some dramatic event. It arrived through reflection, through asking difficult questions, questions most people avoid. Questions like, why do I keep repeating the same emotional patterns? Why do certain relationships feel familiar? Why do I react the way I do? Why am I afraid of being fully seen? Those questions matter, because answers create freedom. Without answers, people repeat the same stories. Different faces, different circumstances, same outcome, again and again. This is one of the deepest lessons hidden inside relationship psychology. People often think they're searching for someone new, but unconsciously, they're searching for something familiar, even when that familiarity creates pain. Why? Because the brain values certainty. Familiar discomfort often feels safer than unfamiliar growth. That explains many relationship struggles. It explains why people stay emotionally guarded. It explains why they avoid difficult conversations. It explains why they pull away when closeness increases. And suddenly everything begins making sense. What Elon realized at that moment changed everything. Growth wasn't about finding perfect circumstances. Growth was about becoming aware. Awareness changes patterns. Patterns change behavior. Behavior changes relationships. Relationships change lives. But awareness alone isn't enough. Action matters. And action requires courage. Because once you recognize a truth, you face a choice. Ignore it, or confront it. Most people know exactly which conversations they're avoiding. Most people know exactly which emotions they're suppressing. Most people know exactly what they're afraid to admit. The challenge isn't discovery. The challenge is honesty. And honesty can feel terrifying, especially when the outcome is uncertain. Yet one question remained unanswered. What if vulnerability isn't weakness? What if it's actually strength? That idea changes everything, because strength isn't pretending not to care. Strength isn't emotional distance. Strength isn't hiding behind achievement. Real strength is allowing yourself to be authentic even when uncertainty exists. And that's where transformation begins. Not with confidence, with courage. Confidence usually comes later, after the risk, after the conversation, after the leap. That insight became incredibly important. Because relationships thrive when two people stop performing and start connecting. When masks disappear. When expectations soften. When honesty becomes possible. The truth was far more complicated. Because emotional intimacy isn't built through grand gestures. It's built through consistency. Tiny moments, repeated trust, repeated honesty, repeated presence. Over time, those moments become something powerful. A foundation. And foundations determine everything. Without them, relationships struggle. With them, relationships deepen. But what happened next shocked everyone. Because the private message wasn't actually about romance. Not entirely. It was about self-awareness. The realization that the relationship you have with yourself shapes every relationship you have with others. Read that again. The relationship you have with yourself shapes every relationship you have with others. If you constantly criticize yourself, trust becomes difficult. If you constantly doubt yourself, vulnerability becomes difficult. If you constantly hide parts of yourself, connection becomes difficult. Everything begins inside, and that realization creates freedom, because it means transformation is possible, not through changing everyone else, through understanding yourself. What Elon realized at that moment changed everything. The search for connection wasn't only external, it was internal, and suddenly the unanswered questions started revealing their answers. Slowly, unexpectedly, powerfully. The fear wasn't the problem. Avoiding the fear was. The uncertainty wasn't the problem. Resisting uncertainty was. The vulnerability wasn't the problem. Rejecting vulnerability was. Those distinctions matter, because they shift the entire perspective. And once that shift occurs, relationships begin changing. Not instantly, gradually, authentically, sustainably. The emotional transformation had begun, but one final lesson remained. One final realization. One final message. And in the next chapter, that message becomes impossible to ignore. Because what Elon eventually discovered about love, trust, growth, and human connection might completely change the way you see your own relationships. The story isn't over. The most important part is still ahead. And the final message may be the one you needed to hear all along. We've come a long way. From emotional distance to awareness. From unanswered questions to deeper understanding. But one final lesson remains. And it may be the most important lesson of all, because every meaningful journey eventually leads back to a simple truth. The relationship you build with others begins with the relationship you build with yourself. That was the realization, the one hidden beneath all the noise. the one waiting quietly beneath ambition, success, heartbreak, and growth. What Elon realized at that moment changed everything. Because fulfillment isn't found through achievement alone. Achievement can create excitement. Achievement can create opportunity. Achievement can create momentum. But connection creates meaning, and meaning is what people ultimately remember. Think about your own life. Years from now, what will matter most? The things you owned? The goals you achieved? Or the people who truly knew you? Most people already know the answer, yet many spend years prioritizing everything except that answer. Why? Because relationships require something difficult. Presence, not perfection. Presence. And presence has become rare. People are constantly distracted, constantly rushing, constantly planning the future, while missing what's happening right now. The truth was far more complicated. Because connection isn't something you find, it's something you build. One conversation, one moment, one act of honesty at a time. Yet one question remained unanswered. What if the message Elon wanted to share wasn't about him at all? What if it was about you? Because every story eventually becomes a mirror. Every lesson eventually becomes personal. Every revelation eventually asks something of the listener. So here's the question. What truth have you been avoiding? Not someone else's truth. Yours. What conversation have you postponed? What feeling have you ignored? What dream have you hidden? What fear have you refused to face? Those questions matter more than you realize, because the future often changes the moment honesty begins. But what happened next shocked everyone. The private message wasn't dramatic. It wasn't complicated. It wasn't revolutionary. It was surprisingly simple. Stop waiting for certainty before you start living. Stop waiting for guarantees before you trust. Stop waiting for perfection before you love. Stop waiting for fear to disappear before you act. Because fear rarely disappears first. Action comes first. Growth follows. Confidence arrives later. That pattern appears everywhere. In relationships, in careers, in personal transformation. People wait until they feel ready, but readiness is often created through movement, not before it. What Elon